Now, although we don't really think of mkfs as being part of our maintenance utility, it's primarily used for file system creation. I suppose there are some maintenance issues that we can consider. One of the things, of course, when we're creating the file system is we could run a check for bad blocks before we create the file system. And we can also use the -m option, so we can change the percentage of disk space that are reserved for system activity, which is typically the online defrag that happens. So when we're writing data to disk, whilst the disk isn't nearly full, we don't really have a problem because there's lots of space available to rewrite our data. But once we get above about 90 or 95% full, then we're going to need some additional space where we can start defragging our data. And that's what the percentage here is used, our reserved block. So we might consider setting a smaller or higher number, but very often we consider a smaller number these days because our disks tend to be relatively large, and setting, let's say, the default, which is 5%, reserving that, then can waste large areas of disk space. So mkfs, when we're considering creating our file system, we could also consider the maintenance. So we'll double check for bad blocks before we create it, and also think of how much space we need to reserve for the system activity used by defrag. tune2fs is our main utility for tuning the file system. And we've got then the ability to configure the maximum mount count. So we can specify the number of times the file system can be mounted before forcing a file system check. And then the -i, looking at the maximum time interval between file system checks. As well as, of course, later on we can use the -m option to set the percentage of reserved disk space as we looked at previously. The mkswap command, well, generally we're not formatting the file system with mkswap, so we're not really writing our super block data. We are just really writing header information to mark the system as available to swap. However, of course, if we want to reset the partition, then we can rewrite the header. We will get a warning saying that the header is already there and would be overwriting the header. As we've seen, that we can set then an interval based on time or a mount count between when we have to run file system checks. So the idea is to think before we reboot. We might be used to being able to reboot our systems very, very quickly and then just say, yes, it takes about 10 minutes to reboot our system. Yeah, but that's all well and good. And you think then that you're able to reboot it in a short window that you have, but you hadn't checked whether or not there would be any file system check in place. So we can actually do that before we reboot. We can go through and check then our extended file systems with the dumpe2fs, and we can read metadata from that. And one of the things that we might be interested in is actually reading our current mount count and the interval that have been set. So let's take a look then on our CentOS system at using some of these utilities.